Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, August 20th, 1974, in a simple ceremony in the White House, President Gerald Ford nominated Nelson Rockefeller to be his vice president. Ford, of course, had taken over as president after Richard Nixon resigned earlier in that summer. Here to discuss Rockefeller's VP stint and what came to be known as the Rockefeller Republicans, the more moderate wing of the GOP, is, as always, Nicole Hammer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hey, Jody.
And back with us is Harry Enton of CNN. Hello, Harry.
Shalom, my friend.
Yeah, so Nelson Rockefeller, his pick as vice president by Gerald Ford pretty much ended whatever honeymoon Ford had with conservative Republicans because they had hated Nelson Rockefeller for a really long time. And the fact that Ford picks him as his new vice president says that Ford isn't going to be a conservative president, but he's someone who is going to try to reconstruct this Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party, this more moderate wing that conservatives had spent more than a decade trying to get rid of.
Harry, is this decision to sort of appease the more moderate wing, is that something about shoring up the GOP in the wake of the Nixon scandal? Or is there something there about telling Democrats as well, that I'm going to try and have a bigger tent here in the wake of this scandal?
Right. I mean, I think it's part of both, right? You still got to get that nomination through the House and Senate, and you want it to fly through. So picking a more moderate candidate certainly does that. You got to realize as well that you're picking up the pieces from a president whose approval rating was down at 25%. And then the other thing you got to recognize, of course, is that Gerald Ford's running for president in 2 years, right? Mm-hmm. He's running for president in 76, and he's trying to assure the American voter that I'm a different guy than Richard Nixon was. You can trust me, I'm going to run towards the middle. Ironically, of course, he alienated so many conservatives with Rockefeller that Rockefeller did not end up running with him in 76, instead picking Bob Dole. Talk about perennial candidates. There's one right there. So it was an interesting decision, but Rockefeller is a big name far beyond any of his association just with Gerald Ford.
Yeah, and he himself had run for president countless times during the 1960s, again, speaking of perennial candidates, and had really been seen as the leader of this moderate wing. Like he was, if you were trying to conciliate in 1974 to build a big tent going into 1976, that this is the guy that you would pick, not only because of his moderation, but again, like Harry was saying, because he's a household name.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a Rockefeller.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like there were that many sort of names of people who were just going to be sort of exude steadiness in all sorts of ways, which I imagine both Ford and the country wanted at that moment.
Right. Again, you're picking out Rockefeller as someone who in New York had won, I think it was 4 consecutive elections, if I'm recalling correctly. That's unheard of, right? Mario Cuomo couldn't even do that. So, this is a guy who was able to appeal to groups that weren't necessarily your regular Republican groups. Minorities, organized labor, those in the cities. This is a guy who really was able to sort of break the mold, and he represented in the 70s this throwback in some sense of parties not necessarily being well-defined by their ideology in a way that we think of today, where you're a conservative, therefore you're a Republican, you're a liberal, therefore you're a Democrat. Still by the 70s, there was a lot of this going on whereby they were crossing. And, you still had a lot of Republicans, for example, who were pro-abortion rights. That was obviously something that went away after the Rockefeller era. But he is a throwback in many ways. And his sort of demise is an indication of the overall demise of the more liberal Republicans.
Yeah, and he's also, at the same time, we shouldn't paint him as an unproblematic candidate for vice president or vice president in general, because he's an incredibly wealthy man. And at a moment when Americans are starting to look a little bit more closely at things like money and government ethics and government transparency, sunlight, all of those ideas that are really gaining traction after Richard Nixon resigns, putting a multi-billionaire's progeny into the vice presidency, knowing that there's no way to constrain his wealth while he's in office, had some people a little concerned.
Right. Did that come up in the confirmation hearings at all? Because I think certainly right in the wake of Nixon's resignation, there was a lot of talk about ethics reform in exactly the ways you're describing.
Yeah, it did come up in the hearings. It's part of the reason why it took so long for him actually to get confirmed. It takes something like 4 months, which, is a fairly long time when you're trying to get the nation back on track with both the president and vice president. But people were concerned. And in fact, they said, we can't do anything about this. Don't have him put his money in a blind trust, because even that's not going to be able to diminish the power of his wealth. Just let him have it, because this is just what you get when you get a Rockefeller, right? You get a guy with a ton of walking around money.
So they conceded that he was too rich for ethics?
Yes.
Huh. Okay.
And another thing to point out was it was sort of a sprawling political hand of the Rockefeller family, right? You had Win Rockefeller going down to Arkansas, becoming governor down there in the 60s as a liberal Republican. You had Jay Rockefeller in West Virginia, who went on to become a longtime senator on the Democratic side, ran for governor in 72. So this is also the story of a political dynasty, a political family, and Nelson so far has been the closest to actually reach the top, although obviously he did not end up being successful of reaching the ultimate prize of the presidency.
Yeah. So as we start to wrap here, Niki, as listeners know, so much of your research is about the GOP's rightward shift in the 80s and in particular the 90s and the 2000s. What seeds are there here in this notion of the Nelson Rockefeller, this more liberal moderate wing? How can you trace that line through to the stuff that you're working on?
Yeah, so in the 1960s, there really is a kind of war for the soul of the Republican Party between a newly powerful conservative movement that is better organized than this moderate or liberal wing, but has a hard time actually ascending to power, and isn't going to do so until 1980 with Ronald Reagan. Meanwhile, most people think that the future of the Republican Party is with the Rockefeller Republicans, right? Because Barry Goldwater gets smashed in a historic landslide in 1964. Everyone thought that the conservative wing of the party was done with and that Rockefeller was its future. They just got it wrong.
Well, maybe this is too facile a comparison, but I'm thinking of 2012 here, where Republicans coming out of that election do some soul searching and say to themselves, oh, maybe the more moderate wing is the future of this party. And then very quickly we see that doesn't end up being the case.
They called themselves the Reformicons.
That's right.
It didn't happen.
So are there parallels there? Was there talk of can you say that the sort of Mitt Romney wing in 2012 was similar to the Rockefeller wing in 74?
Absolutely, because his dad, George Romney, actually was part of the Rockefeller wing back in the late 1960s. There's a pretty clear through line in the Republican Party to these ideas, even as the party shifts further and further to the right, because Mitt Romney is absolutely a Republican. But it was that same kind of split, and people anticipated that the Reformicons would take the day, but alas, other things happened.
Did not quite happen, but that's often something that happens right in American politics, whereby if you lose an election, you want to get and go more towards the center. That tends to be the case over time. And, even with Donald Trump, in 2016, he was seen as the most moderate Republican candidate, or at least rated by the voters, although I would argue that had more to do with voters unable to actually pick apart his voting profile, how he in fact would cast, or what issue, on what side of issues he would come down upon. But yeah, I think it's just so interesting. You point out George Romney, you point out Rockefeller, and you come full circle to 2012, 2014, so on and so forth, is the move towards the moderate end of the party after those elections or after Nixon leaves office, the moderate wing was much more moderate in 1974 than it was in 2012 and 2013. And I think that just sort of gives you a window of how both parties, and especially the Republican Party, has moved further away from the center of the political aisle, at least as we tend to think of ideology.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Are there any other tidbits about Rockefeller you guys want to sneak in?
I mean, the one thing that we should say about Rockefeller before we close is that had he stayed on as vice president and had Gerald Ford won, he would likely have died before Gerald Ford's second term ran out. He dies in 1979. Reportedly, he had been working in his office. Pretty quickly, they clarify that to say he was working in his townhouse with a...
So Harry is making air quotes here around the phrase working in his office. Sorry, tell us what it might be, Nikki? Or...
It turned out that he was with a 25-year-old aide, a young woman with whom it was believed he was having an amorous affair, and that in the midst of that amorous affair, he had a heart attack and died.
Yeah.
So let's test Harry here. Let's play that out. If that scenario happens, who becomes vice president?
I believe that in that particular case, he would get to appoint a new vice president.
He gets to appoint a new vice president.
Correct.
Okay.
That was exactly, in fact, what happened with Gerald Ford. That's how he ascended to the office.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, we would have had this stretch in American politics where neither Ford nor Rockefeller were elected, and then potentially the next vice president would not have been elected either. I mean, quite a stretch.
Weirdo times the 70s were. Tie-dye clothing or whatever, those high-heeled shoes
Bell bottoms.
everyone was wearing.
That's what you're trying to think
Pet rocks.
Yeah,
Pet rocks. Color television, although that was coming in the 60s, but really made its way in the 70s.
All right, we have successfully named all of the things we know about the 1970s, and that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thank you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Harry, anything you want to mention other than just regular appearances and writing on CNN?
Yeah, just, my writing appears on CNN and I'm on air on CNN.
Great. Okay. Thanks to you, Harry Enton.
Shalom, my friends, be well.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. You can follow us on social media where we're posting a bunch of stuff on Twitter and Instagram every day. That's at thisdaypod, both on Instagram and Twitter. You can also email us, thisdaypod@gmail.com. There's a contact form and a link to transcripts of our show at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
And he comes through the door now with his choice, and the choice, it is Nelson Rockefeller, the former governor of New York, who was leading the list of speculation among many people. A man who is 66 years old, one of the best-known names in America, politically and otherwise, and certainly an international figure in his own right.
Radiotopia.